Hey everyone, it's Mr. Drake. This video is going to take a look at the status of African Americans and their push for equal rights during the Progressive Era, especially through the prism of the movement's two most notable leaders at the time, W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. First, a quick review of the status of African Americans in the United States, primarily in the South, as of about the turn of the century. Legally mandated segregation was the norm as Reconstruction ended, and the protections that had been afforded African Americans in the South by the military and by Republican governments began to go away, and the old guard from before the Civil War in the South sort of reassumes control and ushers in the era of the solid Democratic South. The most notable example of this legally enforced segregation is Plessy versus Ferguson, which was an 1896 Supreme Court case saying that segregation was constitutional so long as the facilities for the two races were equal. This obviously in practice is not borne out, and facilities for African Americans, be it in schools or public accommodations, were very much inferior, despite what the court had said. There was a lot of lack of economic opportunity for African Americans in the South, compounded by the fact that most of them had no formal education whatsoever. The only thing that a lot of them knew how to do was agricultural labor, so sharecropping becomes the norm, and a lot of those people are, in perpetual debt, and it's essentially slavery light in many cases in terms of their being bound to the land because of debt. There are also limits to the political privileges afforded to African Americans. Poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses are all employed with regularity to limit blacks from voting. One of the two most notable civil rights leaders during this era, leading up to the Progressive period, is Booker T. Washington, who was born into slavery in 1856. He's one of the members of the last generation of black leaders who actually experienced slavery firsthand. He attended college in Virginia, and in 1881, at a fairly young age, he helped found Tuskegee Institute, which was a school for blacks in Alabama that primarily taught vocations, skills, trades. It taught people how to teach so that black schools could have educators. And it is now today known as Tuskegee University. It's a very prestigious historically black college, again located in Tuskegee, Alabama, in the eastern part of that state. Because of his experiences with helping blacks learn how to do a skill or how to become economically more self-sustaining and independent, he focused a lot of his efforts on improving African Americans' economic outlook. And his autobiography, which he published in 1901 called Up From Slavery, reflected a lot of these beliefs. The idea that African Americans could improve their place in the world if they worked hard and gained economic equality and gained an education first, and then they could push for social equality. This was a viewpoint that struck a chord with many people in the country, especially whites who otherwise would not be in favor of giving blacks any equal rights at all. But Washington was able to appeal to some of the captains of industry, even such as Carnegie and those guys, because they also pulled themselves up by their own bootstraps, and that's what Washington was saying that African Americans should do. This made Washington really the most acceptable African American in the country to whites at that time, and it even culminated in an invitation to dine at the White House by President Roosevelt, becoming the first African American to go to the White House as an official guest. Washington's views on how African Americans should achieve racial equality are most notably articulated in a speech he gave at the Atlanta Exposition in Piedmont Park in 1895. In that speech, he suggested that blacks should accept segregation and disfranchisement, not being allowed to vote, for the time being, and in return, whites in the South should ensure that African Americans had due process of law and the access to a basic education so that African Americans could learn how to do something and be able to support themselves economically. This was a fairly controversial viewpoint to have among African Americans who believed that they, deserved equal rights because the Declaration of Independence says that all men are created equal, and they, began to say, well, white men don't have to work and become educated to achieve equal rights. Why in the world should we? And this speech became known as the Atlanta Compromise. The compromise referring to the agreement that Washington is proposing be struck by Southern white and black leaders. Education in return for at least temporary submissiveness. And compromise was not meant as a nice term. It was really derogatory, accusing Washington of kowtowing to the white establishment. And you're going to see a backlash against that by this other guy. W.E.B. Du Bois initially supported Booker T. Washington as he was founding universities and schools for blacks throughout the South, but eventually grows to disagree with most of what Washington was saying. Their backgrounds and their upbringings were incredibly different, so it's not surprising that they differed on the ways to achieve equality of the races. Unlike Washington, who's from Virginia, from the South originally, Du Bois is from Massachusetts. He grew up in a fairly progressive, tolerant area. He was Ivy League educated. He's the first African American to get a doctorate from Harvard College. And he is in favor of immediate social equality between the races. And he starts a movement called the Niagara Movement in 1905, and it doesn't last very long, lack of funding, lack of organization, and so on. But in 1909, Du Bois and several other people, white and black, found the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or more commonly known as the NAACP. Du Bois was also a literary figure, like Washington was. His famous work was published in 1903. It's called The Souls of Black Folk. It is also nonfiction, but it is, instead of an autobiography, sort of a compendium of essays about racial issues in the United States, in which Du Bois, again, advocates strongly for immediate social equality, in contrast to Washington's call for economic equality. As I said before, the NAACP and Du Bois stood in stark contrast to Washington's more conciliatory methods of trying to achieve acceptance for African Americans. The NAACP was much more militant, kind of in your face, for lack of a better term. They published a newspaper called The Crisis, which detailed injustices being done to blacks all over the United States. They also stood up for people fighting against imperialism in Africa and Asia. So it was a version of what we would call Pan-Africanism, the belief that Africans or disenfranchised and disaffected people all over the world should join together to unite against their oppressors. Unlike Booker T. Washington, who believed that education should be predominantly vocational, Du Bois believed that African Americans should have the right to a classical education, such as the one he had received at Harvard. And one of the NAACP's big pet projects early on was trying to get a bill passed through Congress that would make lynching, or punishing someone by execution without benefit of a trial, making that a federal crime. And they were very, very vocal about that. Du Bois, as well as a female leader of the movement, Ida B. Wells, who we'll be talking about in class a bit more if you're one of my students. The banner you see there, a man was lynched yesterday, is being hung outside the NAACP's headquarters in New York, and they hung that up every day. An African American anywhere in the country was lynched. So it's pretty clear, if you have been paying attention to this video, that Washington and Du Bois, they want the same thing. They want African Americans to be accepted, productive members of society. The big difference comes in how they're going to achieve that. Economic equality versus social equality. Vocational education versus classical education. So, again, quite the contrast between those two. That'll do it for today. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me in class if you know me personally, or you can post questions in the comments below. Cheers.